They fined me $500 for hunting. The funny thing is, the land I was on wasn't even theirs. It was the ultimate HOA power trip, a bold move from a board that governed our community like a personal fiefdom. They believed their authority was limitless and their binder of rules was gospel. But in their rush to assert dominance, they overlooked one small detail on the county plat map, a detail that would become their undoing. They thought they could punish me for my hobby, so I decided to take away theirs, permanently. This wasn't just about fighting an unjust fine, it was about ending their reign by buying the very ground they walked on. What happens when an HOA picks a fight with someone who knows the land better than they know their own bylaws? For the last 15 years, my life had been built around a simple, quiet routine. My house was the last one on the street, a modest ranch-style home that backed up against a sprawling, 100-acre tract of undeveloped woodland. It was this proximity to nature that had drawn me here in the first place, long before the neighborhood was officially christened Oak Creek Preserve, and long before the Homeowners Association became the microgovernment it is today. My morning started before the sun, with a cup of black coffee on the back porch, watching the mist burn off the fields. I was a land surveyor by trade, a job that suited my temperament. I appreciated clear lines, established boundaries, and the indisputable truth of a well-read map. My father and his father before him had been hunters, not for sport, but for a deeper connection to the land and a respect for the cycle of life. It was a tradition I carried on with a quiet reverence. The woods behind my house weren't just a scenic backdrop, they were a part of my identity. I knew every game trail, every creek bed, and every ancient oak. The land was owned by a timber company based 2 states away, and for over a decade, I'd had a formal, written agreement with them that granted me hunting access. It was a simple, straightforward arrangement between a man and a landowner, a handshake deal memorialized on paper, tucked away safely in my filing cabinet. The community of Oak Creek Preserve, on the other hand, had a very different relationship with that same land. To them, the woods were a free amenity, a green belt that boosted their property values. Over the years, the HOA had unofficially adopted the land as its own. They carved out manicured hiking trails, installed quaint wooden benches at scenic spots, and even published a trail map in the monthly community newsletter. They encouraged weekend family hikes and birdwatching excursions. The residents saw the forest as a manicured park, an extension of their own backyards. They had no concept of its true ownership or the agreements that governed its use. They walked their dogs on the same trails where I tracked deer, completely oblivious. I never made a fuss. I was careful, responsible, and hunted in the deeper parts of the woods, far from their designated paths. I saw no reason for conflict. My world and theirs were separate, divided by a line of trees and a mutual, unspoken agreement to coexist. Or so I thought. The trouble began subtly, as it often does with HOAs. It started with the newsletter. A new section appeared, penned by the recently elected HOA president, a woman named Carol who lived 4 houses down. Carol had a reputation for being meticulous. Her lawn was a perfect, weedless carpet, her seasonal decorations were always deployed and retrieved on the exact date stipulated in the bylaws, and she was the primary reason the association had passed a new rule regulating the specific shade of beige allowed for mailbox posts. Carol's new newsletter column, titled Community Harmony and Standards, was filled with passive-aggressive reminders about trash convisibility and the proper maintenance of flower beds. Then, one month, the column took a different tone. It spoke of preserving the family-friendly atmosphere of the community's shared spaces, specifically mentioning the hiking trails. It talked about ensuring the trails were a safe and peaceful sanctuary for all residents. There was no direct mention of me or of hunting, but I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I knew where this was going. A week later, a new, professionally made sign was installed at the trailhead, paid for with our HOA dues. It was a large, handsome wooden sign that read, Oak Creek Preserve Community Trails. Dawn to dusk. Please be respectful of nature and your neighbors. They were marking their territory, reinforcing a sense of ownership that they simply did not have. I saw Carol overseeing the installation, pointing and directing the workmen with a self-satisfied smile on her face. She saw me watching from my porch and gave a tight, thin-lipped wave. It wasn't friendly. It was a warning. The community's illusion of control was hardening into a conviction of authority. They had created a narrative where those 100 acres were theirs to manage and police, and anyone who used the land in a way that didn't fit their suburban ideal was a threat to their peaceful sanctuary. The unspoken boundary between my world and theirs was beginning to erode, and I could feel the first tremors of a conflict that would force a clear distinction between the rules of a neighborhood and the laws of the land. They were drawing a line in the sand, completely unaware that I was the only one in the entire neighborhood who actually knew where the real property line was. The first move against me wasn't a letter in the mail, it was a carefully orchestrated ambush disguised as a neighborly chat. 2 weeks after the new sign went up, a fellow resident, one of Carol's known confidants, caught me while I was loading my gear into my truck. He approached with a strained, placating smile, wringing his hands. He spoke about his kids, about how they loved the hiking trails, and how some of the other mothers had expressed concern. They had seen me, he explained, walking near the woods in my camouflage with a rifle. He said it was making people uncomfortable, that it didn't fit the image of the community. I listened patiently, my frustration simmering beneath a calm exterior. I explained, for the first of what would be many times, that I had explicit, written permission from the landowner. I assured him that I was a certified safety instructor, that I hunted miles away from the community trails, and that I had been doing so without incident for 15 years. I was polite, logical, and firm. I believed facts were the antidote to fear. I was wrong. My reasoned explanation was not a resolution, it was an act of defiance. The very next day, the first official letter arrived. It was from the HOA Architectural and Standards Committee, chaired, of course, by Carol. It was a formal notice of violation, citing a vague bylaw about actions detrimental to the peaceful enjoyment of the community. The letter was filled with hollow, corporate-sounding phrases like community-wide feedback and proactive safety measures. It didn't mention hunting directly, but instead referred to the brandishing of firearms adjacent to community-managed recreational areas. It was a masterpiece of implication, designed to sound official while being completely baseless. The letter demanded I cease and desist all such activities immediately. They thought they could intimidate me with fancy letterhead and legal jargon. It was time to show them that paper works both ways. I decided to attend the next monthly HOA board meeting. I came prepared. I had my signed permission letter from the timber company, a copy of my hunting license, and a large, professionally printed plat map of the county, which clearly showed the 100-acre woodland as a separate parcel, entirely outside the jurisdiction of the Oak Creek Preserve HOA. I waited calmly for the new business portion of the agenda. When my turn came, I walked to the front of the small community clubhouse, set up my map on an easel, and laid out my case with the precision of a surveyor. I spoke not with anger, but with irrefutable clarity. I pointed to the boundary lines on the map. I explained property law in the simplest terms. I presented my permission letter. I wanted to resolve this not as a fight, but as a misunderstanding. I watched their faces as I spoke. The other board members looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. They were homeowners, not legal experts, and the hard evidence I presented was clearly giving them pause. But Carol was unmoved. Her expression was like granite. When I finished, she didn't even look at my map. She thanked me for my passion and then proceeded to dismantle my entire argument with pure, unadulterated nonsense. She claimed the HOA's responsibility wasn't defined by property lines, but by the welfare and perceived safety of its residents. She said that while the land might technically be private, the community had acted as its steward for years, and that stewardship gave them the moral authority to regulate activity on it. She dismissed my legal permission as a side agreement that had no bearing on our community's standards. It was a breathtaking performance. She was rejecting reality itself in favor of her own imagined authority. The board, caught between my facts and her force of will, buckled. They voted to take the matter under advisement and review it with their legal counsel. It was a coward's move, a transparent delay tactic. I left that meeting with a cold, hard certainty. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was a war over territory, and they had just declared that maps and laws didn't matter. A month went by in tense silence. I knew they were watching me, so I took precautions. For my next hunt, I drove my truck several miles down the main road and entered the woods from a public access point, circling back deep into the property, far from view. It was ridiculous that I had to sneak onto land I had every right to be on, but I wanted to deny them any ammunition. It didn't matter. 2 days later, the second letter arrived. This time, it was a fine. $500. The violation was for possession of a firearm in a community common area. Attached was a grainy, long-distance photo of me, nearly obscured by trees, taken from the back window of a house I recognized as belonging to another of Carroll's loyalists. They had been actively surveilling me. The sheer audacity was staggering. They had trespassed on private property to photograph me on that same private property, in order to fine me for being there. My frustration finally hardened into something colder and more resolute. This was no longer just about my right to hunt. It was about dismantling a petty tyranny that believed its power was absolute. I sent a registered letter back to the board, refusing to pay the fine and citing the specific state statutes that protected my rights. I included, once again, copies of all my documents. I told them, in no uncertain terms, to cease all harassment and surveillance. Their response was to escalate. Carroll weaponized the community newsletter. A new anonymous section called Resident Watch appeared. It spoke of ongoing concerns about an individual who refused to abide by community safety standards and was seen patrolling the forest border with a weapon. The language was chosen to paint me as a dangerous outsider, a threat lurking just beyond their perfect lawns. The social chill was immediate. Neighbors who once waved now pointedly looked away. I saw parents steer their children to the other side of the street when I was out checking my mail. I was being systematically ostracized, cast as the villain in a story Carroll was writing month by month. The HOA then planted a new series of signs directly on the timber company's land along the trail entrances, warning, no hunting or firearms permitted. HOA enforced. It was a lie, an illegal assertion of authority on land they didn't own, but to the average resident, it looked official and intimidating. The fines kept coming, one every time I was even suspected of going into the woods. With late fees and penalties, the total they claimed I owed swelled to over $2,000. Then came the letter I had been half expecting. It was from a law firm, written on intimidatingly thick cardstock. It informed me that the Oak Creek Preserve HOA was preparing to place a lien on my property for failure to pay outstanding fines. That was the line. Threatening my home, the very foundation of my life, over a dispute about land that wasn't even theirs. All my attempts at reason, at dialogue, at presenting indisputable facts, had failed. They would not listen to logic. They would not respect the law. They only understood power and control. That night, sleep was impossible. My anger was a cold, white-hot fire. But as I sat at my desk, surrounded by the letters, the maps, and the photos, the anger began to coalesce into a plan. My surveyor's mind took over. I had been fighting them on their terms, reacting to their moves. It was time to change the battlefield entirely. I went back to the county records office, but this time I wasn't just looking at property lines. I pulled the master zoning plan for the entire district, the original development proposals for Oak Creek Preserve, and the full incorporation documents for the HOA itself. I spent hours tracing the history of every parcel of land, cross-referencing deeds and tax records. I was searching for a crack, a flaw, any piece of leverage they had overlooked. And then, in the dusty archives of the County Zoning Commission, I found it. A document from 20 years ago, a conditional zoning variance for the 100-acre tract of woodland. It was public record, but so old and obscure that no one in the HOA had likely ever seen it. It stated that the timber company, as a condition of selling the adjacent land to the developer of our neighborhood, had retained the right to sell the parcel for future residential development. The woods the HOA saw as a permanent, protected park were, in fact, a ticking time bomb. My heart pounded as I dug deeper. A quick search of commercial real estate listings brought me to a page that made the air leave my lungs. The timber company, hit by a recent industry downturn, had quietly put the entire 100-acre parcel up for sale 3 months ago. The listing was discreet, aimed at developers, not the general public. It was a liquidation. They didn't want the hassle of managing it anymore, they just wanted the cash. I stared at the screen, at the listing price, at the agent's contact information. The HOA was threatening me with a lien for a few $1,000s, trying to control a piece of land through flimsy rules and intimidation. They had no idea that the very ground beneath their precious hiking trails was for sale. A plan began to form in my mind, a plan so audacious, so final, that it made my hands tremble. They wanted to teach me a lesson about community standards. I was about to teach them a lesson about land ownership. The HOA's final move was an act of supreme arrogance, a public declaration of their victory. An email was sent out to the entire community, and a notice was pinned to the clubhouse bulletin board, announcing a special, community compliance hearing, as the main event of the next monthly meeting. My address was listed on the agenda, followed by the subject line, Review and Authorization of Property Lien Enforcement for Unpaid Fines. They weren't just going to file a lien, they were going to hold a public spectacle. It was a modern-day stockade, a ceremony designed to shame me into submission and serve as a chilling warning to any other resident who might consider defying the board. They had given me a 2-week notice. They thought they were giving me time to panic, to beg for a payment plan, to fold. What they were actually giving me was a deadline. While they were busy drafting their speeches and preparing for my public execution, I was liquidating my life. My first call wasn't to a lawyer, it was to the commercial real estate agent whose name was on the land listing. I presented myself as a professional surveyor representing a private buyer, interested in a quick, all-cash purchase. The agent, accustomed to dealing with slow-moving developers, was intrigued. The timber company wanted out, and my offer was a lifeline. Then came the hardest part, the money. The asking price was substantial, an amount far beyond my savings. Securing a traditional loan for undeveloped land on such a short timeline was impossible. There was only one path. I sat at my kitchen table for an entire night, staring at my financial statements. My retirement account, the 401k I had diligently contributed to for 20 years. The equity in my home, the one they were trying to put a lien on. It was everything I had. Taking that money was more than a risk, it was a leap of faith off a financial cliff. There would be massive tax penalties for the early withdrawal. A second mortgage would saddle me with debt for the rest of my life. For a moment, the sheer scale of it almost paralyzed me. Was I really about to risk my entire future over a fight with a neighborhood bully? But then I pictured Carol's smug face, I pictured the warning signs on land that wasn't hers, and I pictured the lien notice. This wasn't just a fight anymore. It was about drawing a final, permanent line that no one could ever cross again. The next morning, I made the calls. I emptied my retirement account. I signed the paperwork for a home equity line of credit that made my hands shake. The money, minus the government's painful cut, was wired to an escrow account within a week. The closing was a blur of paperwork and adrenaline. Because I was a surveyor, I knew the land intimately. I knew there were no hidden easements or environmental issues. I confidently waived many of the standard contingencies that would have slowed down a normal sale. To the timber company, I was the perfect buyer, fast, decisive, and asking no questions. 10 days after my first call to the agent, and just 4 days before the HOA's scheduled hearing, the deal was done. The county clerk stamped the new deed. 100 acres of prime woodland, the entire northern border of the Oak Creek Preserve, now belonged to me. I held the certified copy in my hands, a simple piece of paper that had cost me nearly everything, yet felt like the most powerful weapon on earth. I made one more purchase that week, 1,000 feet of galvanized steel fence posts and several rolls of heavy-gauge wire fencing. I had it all delivered and stacked neatly in my driveway, a silent, ominous promise of what was to come. The night of the hearing, the community clubhouse was packed. Carol had made sure of it. It seemed every resident I'd ever seen, and some I hadn't, were there. They wanted to see the drama, to watch the final nail be hammered into the coffin of the neighborhood rebel. I walked in and took a seat at the back. I didn't look angry or scared. I felt a strange, almost surreal calm. In my hand, I carried a single, thin manila folder. Carol took the podium, basking in the attention. She began her speech with a dramatic sigh, speaking of the board's reluctant duty to uphold the standards that made their community so desirable. She painted me as a reckless outsider who refused to respect the safety and peace of his neighbors. She listed every alleged violation, every warning, and every fine. She held up a sheaf of papers, the violation notices, and announced the grand total of what I owed, including penalties and administrative fees. "The board takes no pleasure in this," she said, her voice dripping with false sincerity, "but Mr. Miller has left us with no choice. His continued defiance threatens the very fabric of our community. Therefore, I move that the board vote to authorize our legal counsel to immediately file a property lien for the full amount." She looked at me, a triumphant glint in her eye. The board president, a man who always followed Carol's lead, looked down at his notes. "Mr. Miller," he said, "do you have anything to say before we call the vote?" I stood up and walked to the front of the room. The air was thick with anticipation. I could feel dozens of pairs of eyes on me. I placed my folder on the podium. "Yes, I do," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I believe there has been a fundamental and profound misunderstanding regarding the jurisdiction of this board. I didn't talk about hunting. I didn't argue about the fines. I didn't try to defend myself. Instead, I opened the folder and pulled out the single, notarized, county-stamped document. This is a certified copy of the deed for the 100-acre parcel of land commonly referred to as the Oak Creek Community Trails, I announced, holding it up. As of 4 days ago, all rights, titles, and interests in that property were transferred. I paused, letting the weight of the moment hang in the air before delivering the final blow. To me. I placed the deed on the table in front of the board members. A wave of confused murmurs swept through the room. Carol's smug expression dissolved, replaced by a mask of stunned disbelief. She snatched the paper and her eyes darted across the legal text, searching for a flaw, a trick. But there was none. My name was there, clear as day, under grantee. I let her squirm for a moment before continuing. "Since every single violation you have cited occurred on what is now, and has always been, private property, this board has no legal authority to issue fines related to it. Your notices are void. Your penalties are unenforceable. And your lien is a fantasy." The room fell into a dead silence. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been annihilated. But I wasn't finished. I turned my attention back to the board, my voice now carrying a new, harder edge. "Furthermore, as the new legal owner of the property, I have to address a serious issue. For years, this HOA has actively encouraged residents to trespass on private land, creating a massive liability issue. You've maintained trails and installed benches without the landowner's consent. In the interest of safety, and to protect myself from any potential legal action, I am announcing tonight that the land is now closed to all non-authorized individuals, effective immediately." A gasp went through the crowd. This was something they hadn't even considered. Their hiking trails, their kids' play area, their precious green belt, gone. "A fence will be installed along the entire property line starting tomorrow morning," I said, looking directly at Carol, whose face had gone pale. "There will be no trespassing signs. Anyone found on my property will be dealing not with the HOA, but with the county sheriff." I picked up my deed, folded it carefully, and placed it back in my folder. I looked around at the sea of stunned, confused faces. They had come for a public execution, and had instead witnessed a public dismantling of their entire world. They had tried to take my home with a piece of paper, so I took their kingdom with one of my own. The war was over, but the consequences were just beginning. The drive home from the clubhouse was the quietest 5 minutes of my life. I didn't feel triumphant or celebratory, just the profound, bone-deep exhaustion of a soldier after a long and brutal war. The adrenaline that had carried me through the meeting had evaporated, leaving behind the cold, stark reality of what I had done. I had wagered my entire financial future, every penny I had saved for retirement, on a single, decisive act of defiance. The victory felt hollow, overshadowed by the enormity of the cost. I pulled into my driveway and saw the stacks of fence posts and rolls of wire glinting under the streetlights. They were no longer just materials, they were a monument to my decision, a 1,000-foot line drawn between my life and the rest of the world. There was no going back. The next morning, as promised, the fencing crew arrived at dawn. The sound of their gas-powered post driver was a percussive, rhythmic declaration of intent, echoing through the unnaturally quiet neighborhood. Each thud drove a steel post deep into the earth, a sound that was, for me, the sound of finality. I walked the property line with the crew foreman, my old surveyor's map in hand, ensuring every post was placed with legal precision. By midday, the residents began to emerge. They stood on their manicured lawns, arms crossed, watching the fence go up. Some stared with open hostility, others with a look of bewildered sadness. They were watching their unofficial park, their weekend playground, being methodically and legally amputated from their lives. Carol came out onto her porch, her face a thunderous mask of impotent rage. She yelled something at the workers, but her words were swallowed by the engine's roar. Her authority was gone, reduced to a shrill, unheard cry from a distance. The fence was the new authority. The fallout within the community was immediate and catastrophic for the HOA. My public dismantling of their power had shattered the illusion of their omnipotence. The board convened an emergency meeting, not to fight me. Their lawyer had apparently informed them in the bluntest possible terms that any legal challenge would be frivolous and costly, but to deal with the internal rebellion. Residents were furious. They weren't just angry at me for closing the land, they were furious at the board for provoking the situation. They were furious that their HOA dues had been spent on legal threats and surveillance that had led to this disaster. They demanded to know why the board had never verified the land's ownership, why they had picked a fight based on Carol's personal vendetta instead of legal facts. The entire conflict, which Carol had framed as a crusade for community safety, was exposed for what it truly was, a petty abuse of power that had cost every resident dearly. At a special meeting 2 weeks later, Carol was removed as president of the HOA in a unanimous vote of no confidence. Her reign, built on a foundation of beige mailboxes and imagined authority, had crumbled to dust. She sold her house and moved away less than 6 months later, unable to endure the daily, silent judgment of the neighbors she had once ruled. In the years that followed, the Oak Creek Preserve changed. The HOA, humbled and nearly bankrupted, became a shadow of its former self. It retreated to its core, mundane functions, managing the front entrance landscaping and sending out yearly dues reminders. The oppressive oversight vanished. People started painting their doors unapproved colors. A few basketball hoops appeared at the ends of driveways. The meticulously crafted illusion of uniform perfection gave way to the messy, imperfect reality of individual lives. The community, in a strange way, became more of a community. Without the HOA as a common enemy or a source of division, neighbors started talking to each other again, not as potential rule breakers, but simply as people. For me, life settled into a new kind of normal. The fence became a part of the landscape, a permanent fixture that redefined the edge of my world. The woods behind my house were truly mine. The quiet was absolute. I could walk the old trails, now overgrown and returning to their natural state, without the fear of being watched or judged. The rotting benches the HOA had installed were slowly being consumed by moss and time, monuments to a fallen empire. I hunted when I wanted, not in defiance, but in peace. My connection to the land, once a source of conflict, was now my sanctuary. But the victory was not without its scars. The financial burden was real and heavy. The property tax bill for an additional 100 acres was staggering. The second mortgage on my house was a constant, looming presence in my monthly budget. My retirement, once a comfortable certainty, was now a distant, hazy goal that I would have to start building again from scratch. There were days when the weight of that financial reality was suffocating, when I would look at the fence and wonder if the peace it provided was worth the price I had paid. Yet, every time that doubt crept in, I remembered the feeling of helplessness, the cold knot of anxiety in my stomach every time I saw an official-looking envelope in my mailbox. I remembered being made to feel like a criminal in my own home, a threat to the community I had been a part of for over a decade. They had tried to take my home through intimidation and baseless fines. They believed that a rule printed in a binder was more powerful than a right enshrined in law. They believed their shared delusion of ownership was more real than the ink on a deed. They were wrong. They pushed me until I had no choice but to push back, not with their flimsy rules, but with the fundamental, unyielding power of the land itself. I didn't just buy 100 acres of woods. I bought my peace. I bought my freedom. I bought the permanent, undeniable silence of my aggressors. And that raises the ultimate question: what is the price you would be willing to pay not just to be left alone, but to ensure you could never be bothered again?